Good morning and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Jonathan Salant, the Washington correspondent for New Jersey Advanced Media and the Star-Ledger, and a past president of the club. Columnist George Will once said that the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York wrote more books than most senators had read. Today's guest, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, has written even more books than Senator Moynihan. But remember, there are 4 times more House members than there are senators. Speaker Gingrich is here today to talk about his latest book, Understanding Trump. We'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll take questions from the audience before he signs the books. If you have not previously purchased your book, please do so now. Proceeds from today's event benefit the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the club's nonprofit arm that does journalism training and helps the club on press freedom issues. Before we begin, please turn off or silence your cell phones. I'd first like to acknowledge the members of the headliners team responsible for organizing the event. And if you're in the audience, please stand and be recognized. Betsy Fisher-Martin, Lisa Matthews, Laurie Russo, Heather Forsgren-Weaver, Bill Pierce, Joe Luchak, Frank Massano, and Press Club staff liaison, Lindy Underwood. Thank you all. I first met Speaker Gingrich 40 years ago when I staked out a town hall meeting he was holding outside of Atlanta. They asked him about whether New York Governor Mario Cuomo would play in the South if he ever ran for president. Cuomo never did run, but Speaker Gingrich did in 2012, and for a while led opinion polls for the Republican presidential nomination. In fact, I got to spend a week with you in Florida while you were running. In the interim, this former professor of history became a historical figure himself, leading a successful effort to end 40 years of Democratic control of the House and becoming Speaker in 1995. He resigned following the impeachment of President Clinton and the unusual loss of House seats in the 6th year of a term of a president of an opposition party. While Speaker Gingrich never reached the White House, the candidate he supported did, despite polls up until Election Day showing Hillary Clinton ahead, and sites like Nate Silver's 538.com giving her a better than 70% chance of becoming the first female president. Donald Trump wound up as the nation's 45th chief executive. From his perch as a top Trump advisor and someone still close to the White House, Speaker Gingrich is in a unique position to discuss what makes this billionaire businessman with no previous political experience tick. In fact, the Speaker points out in his book, Understanding Trump, President Trump is the first chief executive with no previous political experience, never ran for office before, came right out of the business world. As the blurb on the back cover reads, this is, quote, the first book written about the world of President Trump by someone who is actually a part of it, unquote. Speaker Gingrich, thank you for coming. Since we've both been in Washington, it's usually the establishment candidate who wins the Republican nomination over the insurgent. George Herbert Walker Bush, Bob Dole, George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney over you in 2012. But in 2016, Donald Trump emerged victorious. What changed between 2012, when you were the insurgent, and 2016, when Donald Trump played that role and won?
Well, I say first of all that in '64, Goldwater won the nomination against the entire establishment, and in '80, Reagan won the nomination, and those were, in fact, the precursors to Trump, as I think the contract with America was in '94. So I feel a little bit fortunate in that I worked with Reagan both as candidate and president while I was in Congress. We led the contract with America, and now you have Trump. So I think the three actually have a continuity despite the traditional establishment. There are a couple of things. I mean, first of all, Trump is just a lot better candidate than I am, and I think you have to start with that. He's a unique phenomenon. At one point, he called and asked me for advice on debating, and I laughed at him. I said, I'm not going to give you any advice. I said, you have a unique style, you are stunningly effective, and if you tried to learn what I do, you'd get totally screwed up. I said, just be who you are, do what you do, and I actually think he's a better debater than I am, if you measure the audience rather than sort of a Princeton debate system, to cite Ted Cruz. I think second, Romney had an enormous advantage. I beat Romney in South Carolina, and they spent about $15 million beating me in Florida. And they knew it was life and death. I mean, there was actually a New York Times story about one of Romney's advisors the day after South Carolina saying, if you don't eviscerate Gingrich, he is going to be the nominee. And that may have been true. And I didn't have the resource advantage. Trump had enough resources at any time, you couldn't knock him out. But in addition, Trump did something I couldn't have done that is, I look back on it as one of the great acts of genius in American politics, comparable to FDR inventing the fireside chat. Trump, what nobody in this city this is part of why I wrote Understanding Trump. What nobody in this city understands is Donald J. Trump had a primetime television show for 13 years. It was the top show in the country for 4 years. Now, because it wasn't on PBS and because it didn't follow Downton Abbey, nobody in this city understood that. Nobody in this city said the day he announced, a guy who knows television that well is by definition formidable. And what Trump had learned, and he writes about this in The Art of the Deal pretty decisively, so what Trump had learned in New York in the 80s was that any publicity which printed your name correctly built strength. And so he was happy, and this is part of, and I actually think he should modify what he's doing in terms of the tweets and all that, because I've told him, I think 10% less Trump would be 100% more effective. But he had figured out early on that if he could engage the media, that the hunger of the 24-hour-a-day cable news system and the power of Facebook and Twitter meant that he could just take all the air out of the room. So all these other guys are running around raising money in order to be able to buy TV ads to be on television. You know, Trump would get up in the morning, he would tweet, that would then set up his argument with Morning Joe. He'd call into Morning Joe, who would always take his call, and they'd argue for 25 minutes. Then he would call in to Fox and Friends, and they would have a love fest for 25 minutes. Then he would have breakfast. I mean, he's already generated, you know. And so all morning the media is covering the argument that Trump's in the middle of. Then about 10 in the morning he would do a press event to keep the momentum up. And then about 10 in the evening he would do an hour on Hannity for free. So in the course of a normal Trumpian day, he's at about $1 million free media. Meanwhile, all of his competitors are off the air, running around the country trying to raise money to be able to get on the air. And what was happening was just this sheer name ID. You know, there's only one poll in the entire campaign where Trump's not ahead for the nomination. People tend to forget this. He was the front runner from the day he announced, except for one poll where Dr. Carson pulled ahead. And yet nobody in the elite media could say to themselves, and Silver's an interesting example, nobody in the elite media could say to themselves, if he's the front runner every single poll, could it be he's the front runner? Because everybody in the Washington elite knew he couldn't be the front runner because then everything they believed in would be crazy. And since they couldn't be crazy, he had to be crazy. And if he was crazy, he couldn't be the front runner, even though he was the front runner. I mean, this went on. And so I'm in a situation where I'm watching these so-called experts, who, by the way, have learned nothing. I mean, the stuff you get on TV today is as stupid and as wrong as the people who laughed when he announced, the people who laughed in the primaries, the people who laughed at the convention, the people who laughed in the general election. They haven't learned anything because they can't, because it's a repudiation of their own life. So their choice is, I can believe in a fantasy which at least validates me, or I can decide the world has really changed dramatically and that invalidates me. I pick the fantasy. And that's literally where we are right now, which dramatically, it'll be interesting to see how the dance continues for the next 3 years, because I think gradually Trump will figure out an angle to break out of all this in a way that will be historic.
So it's still happening. You're saying that people haven't learned from the campaign.
I mean, look at the whole Russian fantasy. You know, what happened election night was the Democrats said Hillary can't have lost. And certainly Donald Trump can't have won. So somebody cheated. I wonder, Putin cheated. Do you realize this is all Putin's fault? And that means that there must have been collusion. Do you realize that they must have colluded? And so for the last 6 months, everybody on the left has been just walking around town chanting, watch for the Russian connection, watch for the Russian connection, look for the collusion. Turns out, even Dianne Feinstein, the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, says there is zero evidence of collusion. So now the newest one is, but there was obstruction of justice over the collusion. So the fantasy that didn't occur is now being replaced by the way, technically, the President of the United States cannot obstruct justice. The President of the United States is the chief executive officer of the United States. If he wants to fire the FBI director, all he's going to do is fire him. And somebody said the other day, I thought it was a very good test. If John F. Kennedy had fired J. Edgar Hoover over investigating and wiretapping Martin Luther King Jr., would people have thought that it was obstruction? So there's not really collusion. So what's the latest leak to the Washington Post, whose record, by the way, of running anonymous leaks has actually beaten the New York Times. It's an enormous achievement, and I give the Post credit that in their energy and enthusiasm, they have been even more consistently wrong than the Times, which is actually in the Olympics of stupidity, an enormous, enormous challenge. So the latest thing is Mueller, who will not be able to get anything on Russia and will not be able to get anything on obstruction, is now going to look at finances. And what you're seeing, of course, is this is why when I was Speaker, I opposed renewing the Independent Counsel Act, because what happens is you bring in a whole bunch of high-priced lawyers, they give up their regular career, they're going to look for a scalp. They're going to find somebody. And the Fitzgerald case where Comey brought in the godfather to his children, Fitzgerald, in order to appoint him a special counsel when they knew there was no crime, because in fact Valerie Plame had already been, was no longer a protected name at the CIA, and they knew who had done it. Richard Armitage had leaked it. And they still appointed an independent counsel who promptly decided his mission was to get Dick Cheney. I mean, it is the most grotesque example of a miscarriage of justice and the danger of the power of the government. You go back and look at that case. That's why I am very worried about Mueller. It's not that Mueller's a bad person. Mueller's a patriot. Mueller's a guy who served with great distinction in Vietnam. Mueller, I have no doubt that he is a person who is going to do his best. But he is surrounding himself with a collective group of people who are going to engage in a witch hunt. And I encourage everybody to actually read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is about the witchcraft trials in the late 17th century in Salem. And understand that's the mentality of the left right now. The left right now is engaged in the Salem witchcraft process of, we know somebody's evil, we know somebody's bad, I wonder who we should burn at the stake. Maybe it's you, whoever you are. And I had two young ladies I gave a speech earlier this year at Cornell, and two young ladies who were in the College Republicans said to me that for an entire week after the election, if you smiled, people yelled at you because it was inappropriate to smile when Donald Trump had won.
You know, I know The Crucible. My son, when he was a student at Walter Johnson High School, got to play in that place. Yeah. So I saw the whole thing.
So, and I really do think that's the mood of the left right now.
Let me ask you, this is a press club, let me ask you a press question. You talked about the investigation about President Trump. When you became Speaker, you also faced a series of drips. You also faced an ethics investigation right after you took office. The reason I bring this up is during all that time, you never threatened Gene Cummings of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who had broken so many stories. You never called those of us who staked you out at the Ethics Committee meetings, and I was one of them, enemies of the people. You never called the reporting of information that leaked out of the Ethics Committee fake news. What's different today? Why does President Trump react the way he does to the press, which is certainly different than than you and everybody else has?
Well, I think there are a couple of differences. First of all, let me just say for all of you, because this is ancient history, when I got elected, and the cover of Time and Newsweek, both covers, the week before the election, was angry white men. For those of you who wonder where the left keeps all these things in a drawer, they pull them back out, and let's use that one again. The week after I was elected, I was on the cover of Time magazine as Scrooge. You can look this up. Holding Tiny Tim's broken crutch. It wasn't enough I stole the crutch. I broke the crutch. And the title of the Time magazine cover was, "How Mean Will Gingrich's America Be to the Poor?" That was followed a week later by Newsweek having me on the cover as a Dr. Seuss figure. And the title was "The Grinch That Stole Christmas." Now this was my entry into press neutrality in the modern era. In fact, those two covers didn't hurt me at all because they sent a signal to the middle class that we were for welfare reform, and the middle class sort of thought, well, that's really cool. I'm glad he's for welfare reform. The cover disappeared. So now we get to one of the mistakes in my career. Democrats filed 83 charges against me. 82 of the charges were dismissed. And the truth is, by the third charge, I should have filed a charge against the people who were doing it, because it was a deliberate political abuse of the ethics process, and I should have moved, frankly, to expel them. That's a mistake on my part, because they knew they were phony, they knew they were absurd, but they also knew it was, and this is what Trump faces, they knew it's a constant repetition. Something must be wrong. I mean, if somebody files 82 charges against you, the one charge, and by the way, we also won in federal court against the Federal Election Commission, and we won in federal court against the IRS. So when I talk about the deep state, I have lived this, okay? Now, the one charge they got me on is a letter written by the law firm which had a mistake. It was clearly a mistake, which I should not have signed, where I said GOPAC had never done anything that was federal, and clearly they had. That's the one thing they got me on. We turned over, and this is why I warned the White House to be very careful. We turned over 1 million pages to an independent counsel who had been hired by the Ethics Committee, who later became the Assistant Attorney General for Barack Obama. So you can imagine his bias, okay? 1 million pages. And then we sat down to be interviewed, and he could pick anything out of the 1 million pages. And if I was wrong, I could be guilty of perjury or obstruction of justice. Now you try sometime to remember 4 years ago at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when you were in a meeting with 22 people, did you say X? And that's what they're up against. I mean, this is very dangerous, and I keep telling everybody at the White House, this is not like New York real estate law. This is criminal law. These people are coming after you to put you in prison. And you need to be very careful, and you need to listen to your lawyers. And I say this as much to the president as anybody. This is not a game.
I'm not the history professor, but in terms of history lesson, GOPAC was a group that the speaker had set up to recruit, basically elect Republicans to the state offices and basically build a farm team. And if you look at the Republican majority, a lot of those folks started off as state people who were elected in part with help from GOPAC.
Yep, that's right.
And it turned out to be very successful.
Well, it was one of the keys. We were not a big enough party to compete nationally. And after 1985, we decided we had to dramatically grow the system in order to be competitive. We were like a mid-sized college team in the Super Bowl. And if we were going to ever beat the Democrats, it took us 40 years of being in the minority. It took me 16 years to create the majority, literally 16 years. We tried every 2 years. For 16, we lost in 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, and 92. So when people say to me, boy, 94 was a great year. Yeah, you should have seen the earlier ones. We were trying every year. Well, it wasn't like we magically woke up one Thursday. We've been trying every single year from the time I got elected in '78.
When the Republicans had the majority in the Congress in the 90s, Bill Clinton, the Democrat, wound up working with you on welfare reform, wound up working with you on spending cuts and tax cuts, and you wound up balancing the budget. President Trump had an opportunity to do that as well. He talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure program. Democrats offered to work with him on fixing, not repealing the Affordable Care Act, and yet the president has not taken advantage of that and not forced Chuck Schumer, the head of the Senate Democrats, and Nancy Pelosi, the head of the House Democrats, to sit down and negotiate. He's attacked them and gone his own way. You think he missed an opportunity to reach out to Democrats? You think it wouldn't have mattered?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the Affordable Care Act, it wouldn't matter because that's the signal P document of the Obama years, and any Democrat who voted to repeal it would, by definition, be hit by a primary and probably defeated in the primary. So I don't think that was plausible. I think that on infrastructure, they have a real opportunity to work with Democrats, and I suspect they will get a substantial number of Democratic votes. For example, on Veterans Administration reform, they've been carrying very large majorities of both parties in the House and Senate. On medical research, they've been carrying very large majorities. Excuse me. So it's not inevitable that they be isolated. But when you get to tax policy, I mean, it partly depends. When Schumer and Pelosi say we'd like to work with you, what's the entrance fee? You know, if the entrance fee is, well, we really don't want corporate tax rates at 20%, well, you're not going to cooperate. We really don't want something which brings back $2 trillion in money that's tied up overseas. You're not going to, you go through a list of these things, So I think it depends on, I believe they can gradually pick off individual Democrats, and I think that the infrastructure bill is the best place to start that process.
You keep talking in your book, and even now you're talking about how the left is so out to get Trump. But it was John McCain, who's nobody's idea of a liberal, who said a scandal is engulfing the Trump administration. Lindsey Graham has criticized the administration. Other Republicans, you read your favorite newspaper, the Washington Post, the former Bush administration columnists are anti-Trump. It's not just the left, right? It's
Sure, look, there are a number, I don't know where you fit McCain and Graham into this. They're clearly among the literati of the right, the people who write precious columns and articles and think deep thoughts. I mean, George Will is one of my favorite examples. Will is a Tory. He likes an elegant world. He likes things to be done in an appropriate way. Trump's very existence offends him. I mean, Trump by Will's standard is a buffoon. He talks at a fourth grade level. You know, he can't be a serious man. And I start, because I'm a historian, I start from a totally different angle, which is I figure a guy who wins a successful hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and that's what it was, it's a hostile takeover, then wins a hostile takeover of the national government, beating both the media and Hillary. He ain't a buffoon. I mean, he may have a style that's different than George Will's style, but he ain't a buffoon. This is a very serious man. And I wrote Understanding Trump in part to say to people, it's always worth trying to understand a president on their own terms. How did they, I had the same feeling about Obama. I mean, or Clinton or Jimmy Carter. I mean, you've got to say, what is it they do right? And what is it they understand that we didn't? And I think, so the literati, the people who write, National Review and stuff like that, they're all, their nose is out of joint. They're offended. He probably doesn't drink Chablis. I mean, and he doesn't actually drink out. I mean, there's so many ways in which Trump's just so wrong. I mean, it's like a reporter came up to me one day and said, when do you think he's going to start becoming presidential? And I said, actually, he did on January 20th. Because by definition, what the president does is presidential. And that was such a shocking idea to this person because they had a model of presidential that didn't relate to how Donald Trump acts.
Let me ask you one last question before we throw it open to the audience, and that's opinion polls. We've all written, he's at record lows. If you were advising him, wait a second, since you do advise him, what would you suggest? What should he do, if anything, to bring up those numbers?
Communicate directly with the American people. Ignore, not waste his time and energy fighting over junk like the Russian stuff. Focus on communicating about jobs, where he's done a pretty good job already. Focus on communicating about infrastructure. Focus on communicating about a better health future. Focus on communicating about tax cuts to create more jobs. I mean, there are positive things that they're doing. I mean, they ought to spend a full week on the Veterans Administration. They have already this year done so many things, both with the Congress, in all fairness. I mean, the Republican House and Senate have passed more reform legislation for veterans this year than ever in history. Already done it in the first 5 months. But none of it's going to get covered by the elite media. So they need to figure out a strategy, as Reagan would have, to maniacally focus on, if they did a veterans rally every day for 5 days in different parts of the country talking about the great achievements in reform, by the end of the week, people begin to go, oh, they must be doing something right. And they have to understand, I mean, what we're learning is what his base is. His base is between 39 and 41. That with everything the Times says, everything the Post says, everything that CBS News says, his base is 39 to 41. Now, the question is, can he add 10 points? Mayor Bloomberg said the other day he fully expects him to get reelected. I love saying in front of liberal audiences, during Trump's second term. I mean, you see people, there are people in the audience who start quivering. I mean, their mind can't adjust to that concept.
Well, let's throw it over to the questions. Please identify yourself. I think we have a microphone that's going to come over, and let's start in the front row right there.
Mr. Speaker, Kevin Wensing, retired Navy captain. We met in the first Gulf War when he came over to visit us. My question is about the Paris Climate Agreement, and could you comment on that? There's, like you mentioned, Mayor Bloomberg, right? Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor of D.C., a lot of mayors are saying we're going to adhere to it regardless of what the White House does. How do you think that is going to play out?
Well, I mean, look, I think being mayor nowadays is a symbolic behavior of the left. So you have to be for a sanctuary city. I mean, you know, how can, just as a side note, how can Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, with 4,000 people shot last year, want to be a sanctuary city so they don't turn criminal aliens over to the federal government to deport? I mean, how can Emanuel believe putting a criminal alien back on the street is a good idea in a city that had 4,000 people shot? But this is the same thing. So they make great postures, right? Oh, we're going to enforce the Paris Accord. Well, what does that mean? San Francisco is going to buy only electric cars, and then are they only going to buy electricity from solar power and wind power because if they just buy electric cars, but the electricity comes from coal, they didn't do a whole lot to help with carbon. You know, I mean, so you go through these, you know, because it's all just public relations nonsense. I urge everybody who's concerned about this to actually read Trump's speech. It is a brilliant economic speech. I was doing an event yesterday with a liberal Democrat, and he said, what Trump has done is created a zone where China can now take the lead on the environment. And I said to him, that's great. China promised to start doing something in 2031. This means we're going to move the Chinese up by 14 years. I think that's fabulous. Do you think they'll start next week? I want to see the Chinese, you know, I want to see the Chinese take the lead. The truth is, the country on the planet which has done the largest reduction in carbon of any country in the world as a percentage is the United States. And we're moving now to a point where we're presently going to have about the same level of carbon loading we had in the 1970s. Now, I'd love for the Chinese to try to do that because in the 1970s there was no Chinese industry. They can't possibly get to that, okay? So, but if you read, and this is the whole problem of the modern left, which is essentially an emotional symbolic system that uses, you know, ranting as a substitute for thought. If you look at that speech, it's a very detailed, very specific speech about economics. And it says basically why, for example, the Indians have said, if you give us a couple $1 trillion, we'll be glad to do something about the environment. Now, why would we give India money? I mean, explain to me the theoretical model by which I'm going to tax somebody in Atlanta, Georgia, to ship it to New Delhi. And it's not that I'm anti-Indian, I'm just pro-American.
Over there. Right, you. Yes. And
Hi, Alan Schlafer, Wharton, D.C. Innovation Summit. You mentioned healthcare. It's a $3 trillion industry. The so-called Affordable Care Act is costing people $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 per person in business and other families per year, which I would suggest highly unaffordable. What is the path to better health care and more moderate costs than what we're paying now?
Well, I'm going to say two things that are probably heretical. This comes from a lot of experience in dealing with health issues, including reforming Medicare in 1996, which doing that in a presidential year was probably the most elegant thing we did while I was Speaker. I think health is the most complex thing in American society. I'm fairly knowledgeable about health, and I'm fairly knowledgeable about national security. I would say health is 10 times more complicated than national security. It is always a mistake to write big bills. We don't know enough to write big bills. Any big bill has unintended consequences. That it's always a mistake to write it in secret. I think that the fact is, sooner or later you have to publish the bill. When you publish the bill, people are going to study it. The earlier they study it, the earlier they're going to tell you what doesn't work. And then you've got to make a series of choices. I also think we are trapped into a model, and this is a good example where Trumpism has not yet penetrated, okay? They are trying to write a bill which meets Senate reconciliation rules and Congressional Budget Office scoring. Now, both are stupid. Okay, the reconciliation rules are an artifact of an earlier era and make no sense as a practical matter. The idea that you would redesign the entire health system of the United States so that the Senate parliamentarian approves it is just utterly irrational, okay? The Congressional Budget Office is a disaster. Go look how often it's wrong. And yet they pretend that it's right. The New York Times in '93 wrote this great editorial because the CBO had come in with a really bad score on Hillary Care. And the Times said, the idea that you can project a 20 or 30-year pattern for that large a section of society is absurd. Well, it is. So in a truly Trumpian world, you would abolish the CBO, you would change the Senate reconciliation rules, and you would say, as a practical common sense matter, where do we want to get? We want to get to maximum personal choice. We want to get to everybody having access to care, and most people having access to insurance. The two are different. You have 8,000 federal community health centers. They're never figured into a health bill. But why aren't they, if we're paying for 8,000 community health centers, why aren't they an integral component of what we're doing? Instead, we allow the left to define success as 100% insurance, which nobody gets. Canada doesn't have 100% insurance. And then we contort ourselves to try to get to it. If you look at what Maine has done, for example, you can do two things. Create a high-risk pool, and you can guarantee everybody coverage with no matter what the precondition. And there are ways to do that. They're not complicated. They cost some money, but frankly, given the total waste in Obamacare, it's not that hard to do. And so that's part of what you do. Second thing is, what I would do to really reform Medicaid is really simple. And this is what Maine did recently, which Mary Mayhew is the commissioner who did it. And they're now going to run for governor, and she's really, really a great reformer. Maine passed a rule that if you're an able-bodied adult with no children, you have to work in order to get Medicaid. Of the 12,000 males who were on Medicaid who fit that category, 11,000 went and got jobs and are no longer on Medicaid. So this is a radical idea for liberals. You actually reduce the number of people on Medicaid by reducing the number of people who need to be on Medicaid so that and the average person had a 116% increase in their income. So they earned more money, had a better future, had a real job, and saved the taxpayers of Maine a substantial amount of money. If you applied that to New York and California, you'd be startled how much money you would save and how many people you'd move back into pursuing happiness and working rather than becoming dependent on the government.
Let me ask one question over there, and then we'll move to the other side, make it easier for our guy with the microphone to not run around. Yes?
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Stephen Kratian here. I wanted to ask if you could talk about the concept of the intellectual yet idiot that Nassim Taleb wrote about, that you reference sometimes, and how that fits into understanding Trump in the context of the elite media, but also the bureaucrats whom he deals with. And if you've talked about civil service reform. Is it possible for him to get around the bureaucracy and get out the intellectual yet idiot types?
Sure. Let me, for those of you who have not yet read the book, I actually include the entire article in the book. Nassim Taleb wrote this article. He's the guy who wrote The Black Swan. And he wrote an article entitled Intellectual Yet Idiot, IYI, which you can, if you Google intellectual yet idiot, it comes up. It's about 800 words. And it was the most satisfying explanation of what I have not understood about modern government that I have read anywhere. And the essence of it, he says, look, at least 40% of modern government is people who are really good at taking tests and writing essays. And because they're really good at taking tests and writing essays, they get into elite universities where they study under professors who are really good at taking tests and writing essays. And then, because they do really well taking tests and writing essays, they graduate and get a job as a Supreme Court clerk or a New York Times reporter or whatever. And the problem is they don't know anything. So they can write a brilliant essay on how to change a tire. But if you have a flat tire, they have to call AAA because they have no idea how to change a real tire. Now, in a sense, this is the ultimate derivation of Halberstam's remarkable book, The Best and the Brightest. Early in Halberstam, which is a great study of leadership decisions in Vietnam, early in the book, Lyndon Johnson comes back from his first cabinet meeting under John F. Kennedy, and he goes to see Sam Rayburn. And he says to Rayburn, the quality of the cabinet, I mean, McGeorge Bundy, the provost at Harvard, McNamara, and he goes down this list of brilliant people, Dean Rusk. And at the end of it, Rayburn says, you know, Lyndon, I'd be a lot more comfortable if there was one Texas sheriff in the cabinet. And what he meant was a Texas sheriff knew that his brand new deputy at 4 in the morning was probably asleep and that he needed to be checked on because he wasn't doing his job. And that in the real world, people behave in real ways. And what you had in the Kennedy cabinet was this theoretical group who had a series of theoretical worldviews, which turned out not to work very well. So they assumed, for example, a rationality on the part of the North Vietnamese. They talked about orchestrating and going up and down the escalation ladder. And in fact, the North Vietnamese were quite clear. They were going to win or die. Now, we could have beaten them, but it would have been horrendous. Or we could accept defeat, which we ultimately did. But they weren't confused. They've been fighting for years. And nobody in the, and this is exactly where we are today. I mean, you have all of these people, you know, and this was, and I was part of this, candidly. I thought there was an opportunity that we could profoundly rethink the Middle East. And I used to tell people, I think we could guarantee democracy in Iraq, and we wouldn't stay a day longer than we've been in Korea. Now, my dad served in Korea in '53. We've been in Korea for 67 years. There's currently no great get-out-of-Korea movement, okay? But you couldn't run in, shatter everything, and run out, and think you're going to have a functioning governing democracy. There's no underpinnings. Well, you start at Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, just as starters. The better part of wisdom would be people who understand maybe being cautious is a good idea, as opposed to we know how to do it. That would be an example.
Over there in the middle. Right here. Guy with the glasses. You, yeah, you.
Hold on, wait, he's working his way to you. Don't.
How much do you think the media is responsible for the left-wing attacks against Republicans?
Oh, I don't think you, I mean, first of all, individual attacks are a function of individual responsibility. And I don't think you want to get into some collective group guilt. If you have an individual who's insane, they're insane. So the guy this week who went out with a rifle, in my judgment, is deranged. Now, I think you could almost use the same term to describe a comedian who holds a bleeding head of the president. And these are personal psychological problems that are manifested by people who have an ideological cultural overview, but the ideological cultural overview doesn't require you to be stupid. I do think that the underlying patterns, I mean, if you look at, it's really ironic, all the talk on the left about bullying, you look at on college campuses, who does the bullying? It's the left. You look at the news media, I mean, CNN was 93% negative according to a Harvard study. Now, you can't be 93% negative unless it's deliberate. You know, and that nobody at CNN feels any shame about it. In fact, they'll even with a straight face tell you they're covering the news, which of course is an absurdity. So I think there's a group think. I think it's very dangerous, very difficult. Some of you have probably experienced this. I mean, you go into the right newsroom and say you're pro-Trump, watch the reaction. You go to the right college campus, say you're pro-Trump. But this is why I worry about the Justice Department. According to FEC reports, 97% of the donations at Justice went to Hillary. 99% of the donations at State went to Hillary. Now, I ask you, what do you think the cultural pattern is in a room where by 97-3, they're donating to Hillary? And that's why I think this idea of a deep state's real. I mean, these are full-time, permanent bureaucrats. In the Pentagon, the term used to be for political appointees that they were the summer help. They just, you know, they'll be gone presently, just relax.
Okay. Over there, right, front row. You, yes.
Hold on, the microphone is
Get the
coming.
microphone over here.
They're bringing it as fast as they can. They're just sort of slow.
Yes.
Thanks. Peggy Archowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook. Hillary told Jorge Ramos during a campaign event that she would never deport an illegal immigrant child, nor his family. I didn't believe her. It was just campaign rhetoric. But how much should this campaign rhetoric be translated into real policy when they become president?
Well, first of all, I actually think you're better off as a candidate to campaign on what you mean, which was Reagan's great strength, and it was our great strength in '94. I mean, you actually say what you mean, and then you do it. I mean, so I think in that sense, rhetoric, it's not rhetoric. Rhetoric ought to be about reality. That's how you build faith in a system, because you actually keep your word. And that's why we became we were the first re-elected House Republican majority since 1928. And it was in part because we kept our word, and people thought, wow, those guys are real. We're also the only group who's balanced the federal budget in your lifetime. We balanced it for 4 straight years. Actually, for 4 straight years. Johnson did it once, I think, by $100 million. Not that it was a gimmick. But I think that let's take the example of immigration. I was very happy this morning that the Department of Homeland Security said that they are not going to deport any of the Dreamers, and that the people who are under DACA are in fact going to stay in the U.S., which I think is perfect. On the other hand, the courts had ruled that Obama's effort to extend that to their families was illegal. And so I think, so Secretary Kelly said, look, I'm going to enforce the court order. If Congress wants to change it, they can. But the court has ruled that the president did not have the authority to extend it from about 600,000 Dreamers to about 6 million people. And so I thought that was a very almost Solomon-like decision. I happen to think the Dreamers should not be deported. I think if you came here at 3 years of age, you don't speak Spanish, and your entire identity is American. It's a little bit goofy to say, good luck in Guatemala. At the same time, that does mean you are potentially breaking up families. We just need to understand that that's one of the sad parts of how you go through historic change. But what about the campaign yet? Well, which kind? I mean, look, all campaigns communicate symbolically. I actually am a Reaganite in that I think you ought to communicate what you intend to do, and you should actually intend to do it. That's not the norm in American politics. Obama promised us you could keep your doctor and keep your insurance policy. He knew it was a lie when he said it. Trump exaggerates routinely. It's part of his salesmanship. You ought to come to my golf course. It's the greatest. It's unbelievable. You can't imagine how great the hotel is. It is the greatest. It's unbelievable. I mean, he became a billionaire by selling. You don't sell your hotel by going, it's actually kind of mediocre. The staff's not very good. Personally, if you can avoid it, I'd go somewhere else. I mean, So, but that brings with it the baggage that he at times overpromises and he at times exaggerates. It's also true, and this is one of the things I wrote about in Understanding Trump that I think is helpful as a pattern. Trump always wants to negotiate down, not negotiate up. So he'll always set the initial term, we're going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it up here, okay? And then the Congress, it was great. They cut this deal with the Democrats to get the continuing resolution, and they can't build a concrete wall, which the Democrats thought they were being very clever. And the following day, after the Democrats claimed how clever they were, they released a picture of the steel wall. And they pointed out, listen, you negotiate with Trump, you got to read the fine print, because this guy has done more contracts than all of Congress combined, and he knows how to negotiate.
Let's say in the front over there.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
My name is Kwame Jamfi. I'm a software engineer, work at the federal agencies. My question is more along the line of whistleblowers. Sometimes when you're working in the agency, you're like light years away from the White House. Help me understand, from your perspective, a framework upon which software engineers like myself would work with this administration, given the animosity towards leakers, the cybersecurity issues that's out here floating around publicly. I represent an organization. It's called Federal Software Engineers and Data Scientists. We're about 350. And so I'm really curious. I wasn't going to even ask a question, but I just could not help but to get your opinion.
It's a great question at two levels. First of all, I would hope your organization might come forward and offer specific advice on how we should be dealing with cybersecurity issues, because this goes back to Nassim Taleb. You actually know something about the topic. That'll be better than most of the guys at think tanks who know about the topic, but they don't know the topic. You actually know the topic. So if your group came up and said, here are 6 things or 8 things you ought to do, that'd be very helpful, and I think would be a step in the right direction. Second, I would hope that you would try to implement the laws of the United States as they relate to your job, and would focus on that and not worry about most of the noise. And then third, and I don't know if this affects you, but it affects a lot of federal employees, we have to rethink the current civil service rules, which operate in such a way that if you're totally incompetent, you still keep your job. And that just weighs, as you know. I mean, the people who love their job and want to come in early and want to work hard and are really excited really get drawn down. When I talked to somebody who runs a small agency, who's actually probably a liberal Democrat, but she said in her small agency, she has one person who for 2 years has come in, put his head on the desk and slept for the entire day. She's actually taken pictures of him sleeping. And she has one person who's never come in 2 years. And she cannot get the HR department to fire the two people. Now, that's just crazy. And that lowers the morale of everybody else in the department. So that's a different zone, I think. And my advice is, obey the law, do your best to help serve America. I mean, it is a great privilege to be able to serve the United States of America. And I say this, I'm a guy who picks on the bureaucracy, et cetera, but I also understand that if you don't have people who care about the country and who work their hearts out, it ain't gonna work. And so I'm glad you're here today. And if you do come up with 6 or 8 serious common sense steps, if you'll get them to me, I will personally put them in the White House. Okay?
Let's, anybody over there? Yes.
Morning, Dave Martin, biomedical engineer, Arlington resident. In your opinion, what are one or more of the ways that the average American person like myself could spend their time, energy, and resources, which are limited, to affect the change that we're talking about and to help the administration, Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, look, I think, first of all, as a private citizen, as an individual, speaking up with your friends, calling in to talk radio, writing letter to the editor. People actually read the letters to the editor more than the editorials. It drives the editorial writers crazy. Do a blog, tweet. I mean, there are a lot of things people can do. Facebook. There are a lot of things people can do to reach out. We live in an era when you can become your own communication system. And you can find other people who agree with you, and you can create a community. And I encourage people to do that. I also think this is an era where, frankly, if Trumpism means anything, it is decentralization away from Washington. So in a sense, that's what this gentleman was talking about. I mean, we want to find ways for everybody at every level to go out and be creative and be positive and do things. And maybe, so the ideas may flow back up to Washington rather than flowing down from Washington.
Yes, right there. Yes. And then we'll move across back to the other side by the time we're done.
Thanks. Peter Lovenheim. What are your thoughts on the election next week in Georgia 6 and the Republican prospects for holding the House in 2018?
I think that it's probably even money who wins in Georgia. Ossoff's not a very good candidate, but he's got over $23 million, which for a single House race is just kind of astonishing. I'd like to have had 10% personally. And that's all that's keeping him up now. I mean, I think that I think he's actually decaying, and only the weight of money is keeping him in the game. The early voting, the Republican vote is up 16%. The Democrat vote's down 23%. And the guess is, this is purely a guess, that on the Democratic side, the college students have gone home, and that they have a real problem finding them and getting them to vote. But apparently, I'm told by people in Georgia that they're now seeing a significant shift towards Handel and away from Ossoff. If that happens, if she loses, we will be battered and we'll be irritated and a little frightened. If he loses after $23 million, this will be the 3rd loss in a row after Kansas and Montana. The left will go crazy. I mean, if they, literally, I mean, they have so much more at stake in Georgia than we do that it's unbelievable. But I would say as of right now, it's at worst an even money chance that she'll win. That's the worst you can say right now. Anybody who tells you they know for sure is, I think, very foolish, because it's a function of turnout the last week. Next year, I think, is pretty simple. It's 2 things. Do the Democrats keep getting crazier? I mean, if you get identified as a party of bleeding heads, assassinations in New York public theater, a national chairman who has to use curse words because he can't figure out how to say anything intelligent, and including a New York U.S. senator who uses curse words. I mean, at some point, that party has a relatively small base because they just sound nuts. That's what happened under Thatcher, and Thatcher is much more like Trump than Reagan, because Reagan never threatened the left in the United States. He defeated communism in Moscow, but he didn't try to defeat it at Stanford. The difference is that, like Thatcher, Trump is a mortal threat to the left. And so the left under Thatcher went crazy, and by her third election in '87, the news media routinely referred to them as the loony left. Well, so the first question for next year is, do the Democrats keep drifting into this insanity, representing a worldview that is 20% or 25% of the country? The second question is, do the Republicans get their act together and actually not just get good things done, but communicate them? They have done so much on Veterans Administration reform, and it has such a weak communication system that nobody realizes this is the best pro-veterans. The House, Senate, and President are the best pro-veterans team we've had in modern times. They're doing real things. It is really working, and they can't communicate any of it. Now, they've got to both learn how to do things that matter, and they've got to learn to break past all the elite media and make sure that every American hears them despite all of the hostility. And if they solve that, and if the left keeps going crazy, we could actually have an election next year where we gain ground, not lose ground.
Let's go around all the way. There's somebody all the way in the back. So somebody all the way in the back, right there. Go ahead.
Thanks, John. And Mr. Speaker, you are a true intellectual giant and widely respected from the point of view that you have. But just to play devil's advocate, isn't it possible that Trump becomes like McCarthy, and who became known as demagogue and imploded? And it took a few years, but it got there. And to give it the framework, the Mueller investigation, you don't think is really going to find anything in terms of Russian money that supported Trump against his bankruptcies when no U.S. banks would, or paying triple the funding, the value for his properties, and Flynn and Manafort, you don't think they'll be actually indicted? And the Senate that just voted 98-2 for Russian sanctions because of what happened in the election. So I know it's something that can be smiled at, but there's a lot of seriousness and a lot of evidence, or do you just disagree that there's any evidence whatsoever and that this is going to go nowhere? But the other thing I wanted to say was thank you for the advertisement for the ROM event that's going to be here at the Press Club on Tuesday. He'll be able to answer your question.
Good. There we go. I'd love to have somebody ask him that. Do you really need more criminals on the street in Chicago? Well, let me take your question at two levels, okay? Because I think that it's very illustrative, and I'm going to go way out on a limb. There's a remarkable book by Diana West called American Betrayal, which I recommend to everybody, which basically says there really were communist spies. That McCarthyism, in a sense, is one of the great victories of the left, because the left decides that they had to smear McCarthy. Now, and McCarthy was a wild man, and McCarthy at times was a demagogue. But the underlying truth was there were at least 500 Soviet spies in the United States. There are people on the left today who will tell you that, in fact, Alger Hiss was not a communist spy. Now, we know, because after the Soviet Empire fell, for a brief period we had access to their records, many of which are at Hoover. And we know that at Yalta, about 2 o'clock in the morning, Alger Hiss met with Stalin and was given the highest civilian award in the Soviet Union for having been such a brilliant agent of influence. I mean, this is not a theoretical thing, yet there are professors around this country who will passionately teach that what Richard Nixon did in going after Hiss was terrible and was part of McCarthyism. We also know that there were a lot of people in Hollywood who were communist. I mean, the reason Reagan becomes so anti-communist is he's the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he goes out and has a drink one night with a guy who says to him, "I am a real Stalinist, and if we win, I am putting you in jail." And Reagan goes home and thinks, this guy's sincere. And he becomes a very hardline anti-communist in 1947, and of course the empire disappears about 44 years later. So one, the very framing of your question I thought was interesting. Two, I think we should look at Russian influence. Why did the bank pay Bill Clinton $500,000? Why did the bank hire John Podesta's brother to be a lobbyist? Why did the people who wanted uranium decision give millions and millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation through a Canadian foundation which does not release who donates to it? So I'm very happy to let's have a broad, and this is what part of what drives me crazy, and is a sign of Republican just incompetence. I think we should look at Russian influence efforts and Russian diplomatic propaganda efforts, but then let's start with the Clintons. I mean, why is it that we're really worried about Paul Manafort, but we're not really worried about these other people? Are we worried about Manafort because he didn't report it? I mean, what is the difference between John Podesta's brother and Paul Manafort? What's the difference? We're worried about money. Well, why aren't we worried about $500,000 to Bill Clinton? Which was paid, I think, at about the same point that Hillary was making the decision about uranium. Now, why does that not matter? Well, it can't matter because, you see, it's impossible for Russia to be pro-Clinton, and therefore, and this was a question actually asked to his credit by a Republican congressman the other day to the former head of the CIA, who had been talking about worrying about the president talking with the Russian ambassador. He said, well, how about if a president said to the president of Russia, as soon as the election's over, I'll be able to do a lot of stuff I can't do now, which is what Obama said to Medvedev. So, I mean, I'm very happy to look at Russian influence efforts in the United States. I just think they ought to be bipartisan. They ought to be open. We ought to know the total amount of money that's poured into the Clintons, the total amount of money poured into the Podestas. I think that'd be terrific. Frankly, I would expand it. I'd like to know how many countries like Saudi Arabia give money to universities to hire professors who end up being propagandists for the countries that are giving the money. I think this is a very important long-term question. I am very concerned about the ability of foreign governments to corrupt the American system, and I think it would be very helpful to have a deep, fundamental look at how much foreign money now penetrates our culture at every level.
On that note, we've run out of time. I want to thank Speaker Gingrich again for appearing.
Thank you.
And before you go, I know you'll be off to the Holy See as your wife becomes ambassador to the Vatican. And you're going to be still on American television. You're going to have to wind up getting up really early sometimes. So for coffee, you can be perky on CNN in the morning or Morning Joe. I'd like to give you the official National Press Club coffee mug.
And let me say, I'd be honored and happy to sign and personalize any books anybody wants to get here today. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for interviewing me. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you. This concludes our book wrap. Good morning.